I mean, he had Tom bloodied up, and Tom didn't want to continue in the fight. So,
Dana White once said, "That's my problem, not his." But what you're about to hear is the story of how he made his problem his champion's nightmare. Those 7 words, spoken just weeks earlier, would become the fuse that lit an absolute firestorm between the UFC president and his heavyweight champion, pushing their relationship right to the breaking point. What we're diving into today represents one of the most explosive, controversial developments in the entire history of the UFC's heavyweight division. Because just moments ago, the truly unthinkable happened. Dana White has made a decision that is sending massive shockwaves through the entire mixed martial arts community. And at the very center of it all is Tom Aspinall, who now finds himself engulfed in a controversy that threatens to define his entire legacy forever. The heavyweight championship of the world, arguably the most prestigious, most coveted title in all of combat sports, has been ripped away from the man who waited longer, who endured more frustration than almost anyone, to finally call it his own.
Well, I actually got eye poked twice in the fight. First one wasn't too bad. He got warned for it. The second one, obviously, Rogan tried to make my head a bowling ball with the double eye poke, knuckle deep in both.
To truly grasp how we got to this seismic moment, we have to rewind the clock to October 20. Picture the scene. Aspinall steps into the Etihad Arena in Abu Dhabi, ready to make the very first defense of his undisputed UFC heavyweight championship against the former interim champion, the incredibly dangerous Ciryl Gane. Now, for Aspinall, this was a massive night, his 19th professional MMA fight, and he was headlining the colossal UFC 301 event. The atmosphere inside that arena was absolutely electric. We're talking 18,000 fans packed to the rafters, every single one of them, expecting an all-out war between 2 of the most technically skilled heavyweights on the entire planet. This night was supposed to be Tom Aspinall's coronation. It was meant to be the moment he silenced every last doubter, every critic who ever questioned whether he truly deserved to wear that undisputed crown without ever having defeated the legendary John Jones inside the octagon. Aspinall, who had been promoted to undisputed champion back in June 2025, following Jones's retirement, had handpicked Gane as his first challenger for what was a legacy-defining, high-stakes title defense.
I mean, he had Tom bloodied up, and Tom didn't want to continue in the fight. So
those words struck like a...
Now, let's talk about the odds and the expectations heading into that night. Ciryl Gane walked into that octagon as a significant underdog, sitting at plus 280, while Aspinall was the heavy favorite at a commanding -3. The entire matchup was billed as a spectacular clash of elite, high-level strikers. Aspinall was on a mission to solidify his reign after a series of incredibly fast, devastating knockouts in his previous title fights. This British sensation had absolutely electrified audiences with his highlight reel finishes, and the overwhelming expectation from fans and experts alike was that Ciryl Gane would simply become the next name on Aspinall's rapidly growing resume of destruction. And so, the fight began. The first round kicked off with Aspinall immediately pressing the action, stalking forward with powerful leg kicks and sharp jabs. He landed a clean, brutal low kick that buckled Gane's leg for a moment. But Gane, to his credit, countered with some incredibly crisp boxing, landing a sharp right hand and digging into the body with powerful shots, looking much sharper on his feet than many had anticipated. In those early exchanges, no truly significant damage was landed by either man, but you could see Aspinall was controlling the center of the octagon, dictating the pace. It was a classic feeling-out process. Both men were carefully establishing their range, and the tension in the arena was palpable. You could just sense that something spectacular was about to happen. After all, the heavyweight division had waited so long for this moment of clarity, and then it happened. The single moment that changed everything. The moment that would ultimately and tragically cost Tom Aspinall his championship. At the 4-minute and 35-second mark of the very first round, as Aspinall threw another one of his signature low kicks, Ciryl Gane extended a jab that accidentally but deeply poked both of Aspinall's eyes at the same time. Aspinall dropped to the canvas instantly, clutching his face in sheer agony. The referee, Jason Herzog immediately paused the action, brought in the doctor, and after Aspinall reported blurred vision and extreme, debilitating pain, the fight was waved off. A wave of boos echoed from the crowd, a sound of pure frustration at the premature, unsatisfying stoppage. The official ruling came down, a no contest, due to an accidental double eye poke. In that single fleeting instant, everything Tom Aspinall had worked his entire life for just evaporated into a fog of controversy and utter confusion.
Well, listen, I didn't continue. I'll tell you why I didn't continue. Because I'm not a dummy. Like, I'm not going to go out there and fight one of the best strikers in the world if I can't see.
With double vision.
With any eye. Look, I know, as an MMA fighter, look, things are going to happen in the fight that compromise you.
The severity of what just happened in that cage cannot possibly be overstated. Let's be crystal clear. This was not some glancing blow or a minor, inconvenient poke. We're talking about a deeply damaging injury that saw Tom Aspinall stretchered out of the arena and hospitalized right there on site. In the immediate aftermath, a distraught Cyril Gane was seen apologizing profusely, insisting it was completely unintentional. As a result, no fines were issued, but the incident itself threw gasoline on a debate that had been simmering for years throughout the mixed martial arts community. The desperate need for changes to UFC glove designs to prevent these kinds of career-altering eye pokes. But what happened next at the post-fight press conference is what truly set the stage for the current crisis. It's where the seeds were planted for the complete and utter destruction of the relationship between the champion and the organization he fought for. Dana White stood before the world's media and delivered comments that would come back to haunt his relationship with Aspinall for weeks and ultimately forever. White dismissed the no contest as a pain in the ass for the promotion and then, incredibly, stated there was no damage to the eye. He deliberately framed the stoppage as Aspinall's personal choice rather than a clear medical necessity, establishing a destructive narrative that would prove absolutely devastating to the champion's public image and reputation.
How did that sit with you?
I was very disappointed. Yeah, very disappointed.
Do you think the way that was phrased led to some of the criticism afterwards? In other words, if he would have come up and said, poked in the eye, illegal, couldn't see, couldn't continue, serious injury, etc., people would have laid off. They would have taken cues from him.
It definitely didn't help the cause.
That single statement from Dana White shot like a thunderbolt through the entire fighting community. The implication was as unmistakable as it was damaging. Tom Aspinall, the heavyweight champion of the world, a man who had waited over 18 excruciating months for his shot at undisputed glory, was now being subtly painted as someone who simply chose not to fight through a bit of adversity. In a brutal sport where toughness is the ultimate currency, where warriors are revered for battling through unimaginable pain, Dana White had essentially cast doubt on whether Aspinall even possessed the heart of a true champion. But what the world didn't know at that moment was the terrifying extent of Aspinall's injuries. The medical reality was infinitely more serious than anyone in that press room could have possibly understood. On November 30th, 2025, Aspinall took matters into his own hands and publicly shared his official medical report on Instagram, finally providing the first real, comprehensive details about his condition. This was his answer to the growing criticism from fans and, more pointedly, to Dana White's dismissive comments. He needed to substantiate exactly why he couldn't continue. The core diagnosis was something called bilateral traumatic Brown syndrome, an incredibly rare condition triggered by severe trauma to the eye's superior oblique tendon trochlear complex. Let me break that down. This is something exceptionally uncommon in combat sports, the kind of thing doctors typically only see in severe car crashes or other major orbital injuries. The fact that it was bilateral, affecting both eyes, makes it even rarer and more dangerous. Brown syndrome severely restricts vertical eye motility, which leads to a horrifying misalignment and visual disruptions that make normal daily activities, like reading or driving, nearly impossible, let alone fighting a world-class professional killer in a cage. And it gets worse. Advanced imaging revealed significant orbital soft tissue trauma and a minimally displaced fracture of his right medial orbital wall. This was not something a fighter could just power through with grit and determination. This was a potentially career-ending injury that left one of the most dominant heavyweights on the planet literally unable to see clearly. Aspinall was experiencing persistent double vision, severely restricted eye movement, blurred vision coupled with extreme sensitivity to light, and substantial visual field loss. He was not, under any circumstances, medically cleared for combat sports, with the looming possibility of major surgery. And yet, despite all of this concrete, undeniable medical evidence, Dana White stubbornly maintained his initial position. And that right there is when the relationship between the president and his champion fractured irreparably.
When do you think you can start training again?
Look, it's not up to me. It's up to the doctors. At the minute, I ain't allowed to do nothing, so I'm just following advice at the moment.
What's next?
What's next for me right now is there's talk of surgery on the eyes. We've got to see how it goes over the next few weeks.
The questions Tom Aspinall began to raise cut right to the very heart of fighter safety in the UFC, a topic the organization has often struggled with. Why, he asked, should any fighter be expected to risk permanent, life-altering damage to their vision because of an illegal action committed by their opponent? More importantly, why should the victim of a foul be painted as the villain simply for protecting their own long-term health and their career? These were fundamental questions that the organization had never really been forced to adequately answer. Then, on December 2, 2025, during a revealing appearance on the Ariel Helwani show, Aspinall dropped another bombshell. He revealed that Dana White had not contacted him a single time personally since the fight. We're talking 6 weeks later, and the president of the company, who had been publicly speculating about his health, hadn't sent a single text. Aspinall confirmed he has no relationship with Dana White and deals exclusively with Hunter Campbell. No text message, no direct message, not a single hope you're doing well in 6 long weeks. To be fair, Aspinall did clarify that Hunter Campbell, the UFC's chief business officer, had been incredibly helpful, offering comprehensive medical support. But that was the full extent of the organization's outreach. The stark contrast between Campbell's professional attentiveness and White's deafening silence spoke volumes about where Tom Aspinall really stood in the UFC's list of priority. One executive was handling the business, but the president remained silent.
Well, look, if you were sidelined from doing your job for like 15 months, not allowed to do anything, you train your off for 6 months for a fight, then to get double eye poked, to be left with no vision for nearly 6 weeks because of an illegal move, how do you think I feel? I'm not feeling fantastic, am I?
Now let's add some crucial history here, because this tension didn't just appear out of nowhere. Between July 2024 and October 2025, Aspinall didn't fight a single time, not because he was injured, but because he was absolutely determined to face Jon Jones for the undisputed title and repeatedly refused other offers. This dedication, while admirable, effectively brought the entire heavyweight division to a grinding standstill. So now, fast forward to the present. Aspinall is facing an indefinite recovery timeline with serious talks of surgery on the horizon and absolutely no clear date for when he could possibly return to action. This put Dana White in a position where he had to make a decision that many believed he would never, ever make against one of his own champions. You see, the championship represents so much more than just a belt around someone's waist. It represents the marketability and health of an entire division. It's the engine that drives pay-per-view buys, secures massive sponsorship deals, and strengthens broadcasting rights negotiations. And an inactive champion for any reason quickly becomes a major liability rather than an asset, regardless of how they arrived at that inactivity. The brutal, unforgiving business of fighting waits for no one, not even for the most loyal soldiers in the organization's army. The collision course was set. To fully comprehend the sheer magnitude of what has just transpired, we have to examine the year of simmering frustration that came before the UFC 3021 disaster. This relationship between Aspinall and White had been deteriorating long before that infamous eye poke. Remember, Aspinall won the interim heavyweight title way back in November 2023, but then was forced to wait over 18 agonizing months for a unification bout with Jon Jones. Jones, in the meantime, returned from his own injury to defend against Stipe Miocic at UFC 309 in November 2024, before abruptly retiring in June. Dana White's deep reluctance to strip Jones during that period fueled widespread accusations of favoritism, with Aspinall himself publicly and repeatedly calling out the ridiculous delay. This wasn't a champion sitting back idly, content to wait for his opportunity. This was an active fighter who repeatedly made himself available, who took fights on short notice, just to prove his worth. who even served as the backup fighter when the organization was in a bind. Yet that unification bout never materialized, and many believe it's because Dana White protected Jon Jones's legacy at every single turn, prioritizing one legendary fighter over the entire career progression of another. Finally, on June 17, 2025, White issued Jones a deadline, telling Jim Rome that the UFC would resolve the saga in weeks or simply move on without the Jones vs. Aspinall super fight. The clock was finally, mercifully ticking on a situation that had paralyzed the heavyweight division for far too long, and fans rejoiced at the prospect of a resolution. Just 4 days later, on June 20, 2025, at the UFC Baku post-fight press conference, White announced Jones's retirement via a simple phone call, officially upgrading Aspinall to undisputed champion. White expressed regret about how it all played out, but vowed to make it up to Aspinall financially. The implication was crystal clear: Aspinall had been wronged by the organization's handling of the entire situation. By September 2025, even Jon Jones himself acknowledged the damage he had caused, admitting he was wrong in the saga, and seeking a face-to-face apology from Dana. White accepted the apology but then barred Jones from a UFC event at the White House, citing major trust issues stemming from the Aspinall drama. The message from the top was clear: Dana White values reliability above all else, and fighters who create complications will face consequences, regardless of their star status. So if Jon Jones was punished for his voluntary delays, what on earth would happen to a champion whose injury now kept the heavyweight division frozen indefinitely? The UFC 3021 fallout created a truly impossible situation for the organization. Aspinall's very first undisputed defense ended abruptly. His career was in jeopardy due to orbital trauma and Brown syndrome, all caused by Gane's double eye poke. Aspinall rightly prioritized his vision over continuing, but this drew immediate fan backlash and White's pointed, damaging remarks. Even after medical reports confirmed the injury's severity, White's post-fight comments created a narrative that stuck to Aspinall like Tom. The phrase, "Tom didn't want to continue," became a weapon wielded by his critics and casual fans alike, who began to question the champion's fundamental toughness. The damage to his reputation was both immediate and incredibly severe.
Obviously, you've been a massive help to the UFC. You've taken a fight on 2 weeks' notice. You've taken a fight in the middle of the night, been backup fighter for Jones versus Miocic, and then obviously the whole Jon Jones saga. How do you sort of see this going forward for yourself with the UFC?
I think right now we just got to focus on the health, innit?
Then, in a November 30th interview, Dana White finally addressed the intense backlash, but his words did little to mend the fences. He said, and I quote, "Nobody is faulting Aspinall for not being able to continue after getting poked in the eye." He then pushed for harder penalties for eye pokes, but confirmed that a rematch between Aspinall and Gane was being prioritized as soon as possible, targeting a date in early 2026 once Aspinall is cleared. But you see, that was the entire problem, wasn't it? That commitment absolutely required a healthy champion who could actually step into a cage and compete, and Tom Aspinall was anything but.
I've said hello here and there, but I don't really have a relationship with Dana. I have a relationship with, I speak to Hunter.
You're the heavyweight champion of the world. You're a huge star. You've taken fights on short notice. You've been backup fighter. You stayed on the sidelines for et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
The harsh reality was that the champion had no timeline for a return. The dark cloud of potential surgery loomed over his entire recovery process. And so, the heavyweight division, a division filled with hungry contenders, sat paralyzed once again. This time, it wasn't because of Jon Jones's contract antics, but because of a severe injury sustained from an illegal foul inside a UFC cage. This whole situation also highlights a deeply troubling pattern when you look at the broader context. It echoes Dana White's long and contentious history of clashes with his top heavyweights, raising serious questions about the UFC's overall fighter relations. Stipe Miocic, the most accomplished heavyweight in UFC history, long felt undervalued by the organization. Francis Ngannou, the most terrifying power puncher we've ever seen, departed the company entirely after bitter disputes over compensation and his treatment as champion. Now, Tom Aspinall found himself completely at odds with the boss in a way that seemed utterly irreparable. In a bit of good news, veteran referee Herb Dean confirmed that post-incident commission meetings have built real momentum for stricter eye poke guidelines, with proposed changes like automatic point deductions for extended fingers and much stricter enforcement. But while those vital discussions continued, Aspinall remained sidelined, his career in limbo. Then, on November 23, 2025, White absolutely ripped into Aspinall for his threat to vacate the title if his friend, Ante Delija, didn't get a shot, calling the idea insane. The friction between the champion and the promoter was visibly escalating with each passing week, with both sides digging their heels in deeper and deeper. By November 30th, Aspinall had escalated his own rhetoric against his critics, emphasizing that rules against fouls don't require fighters to continue while literally fighting blind.
That's fine. If you get punched or kicked in the eye, that's fine. If you get double eye poked in both eyes and you've got no vision because of a foul, why should I carry on? So some dummy can look and say, oh yeah, Tom just got knocked out, because I ain't going to fight if I can't see anything because of a foul. If it's an illegal move, we have to fight through it. That's what we do as fighters. But when it's a foul, why am I going to put my health at risk when I can't see at all?
This whole saga has thrown a harsh spotlight on the UFC's long-standing issues with fighter relations. The organization is incredibly quick to hype its stars like Aspinall on the way up, but often painfully slow to provide meaningful post-injury support, especially when it conflicts with their business plans. It echoes so many past controversies and could, hopefully, pressure some much-needed rule changes. But the immediate burning question remained, what was going to happen to the heavyweight championship? It is critically important to note that the UFC, and therefore Dana White, has the absolute contractual power to strip a champion of his belt in the event of prolonged inactivity or a refusal to fight. This isn't just a threat. This power has been exercised before against some of the biggest stars in the sport. The legendary Conor McGregor was stripped. Georges St. Pierre was stripped. Tony Ferguson lost his interim belt. The precedent not only existed, but had been applied to the biggest names in the history of the sport, and so, with the heavyweight division completely paralyzed, with absolutely no timeline for Aspinall's return, and with the champion now publicly criticizing the organization and its powerful president, the stage was set for an explosive, landscape-altering decision. The question was no longer if Dana White would act, but simply when. The heavyweight division could not and would not remain frozen indefinitely while its champion recovered from injuries that might very well require surgical intervention. The walls were just closing in on Tom Aspinall from every conceivable direction. His devastating injury had rendered him completely unable to compete. His already frayed relationship with Dana White had deteriorated far beyond the point of repair, and the heavyweight division, a business in itself, demanded decisive action that simply could not be delayed any longer. As of December 3rd, 2025, USC CEO Dana White had not publicly responded to Tom Aspinall's most recent comments, where he expressed deep disappointment over White's handling of the eye injury from UFC 31. That silence was absolutely deafening. It spoke to a fundamental, perhaps lethal, breakdown in communication between the organization and its champion, and it foreshadowed exactly what was coming. White's most recent statements on Aspinall, from back in late November, had carefully focused on the broader eye poke issues and the eventual rematch, skillfully avoiding any direct address of Aspinall's personal grievances. No new interviews, no social media posts, no press conferences from White's side surfaced in the days following Aspinall's explosive interview. It was clear the president was preparing his response, but he was doing it in private. This lack of a public response only amplified fan frustration across social media platforms, with countless users labeling White as self-serving for prioritizing spectacle over the long-term welfare of his fighter. Aspinall's fans echoed Aspinall's own sentiment, demanding answers as to why their heavyweight champion was being treated with such apparent disdain. But behind those closed doors, Dana White was formulating his response, and it wasn't going to be with words. It was going to be with action of the most definitive, brutal kind. The organization has stripped champions for prolonged inactivity before, and now Tom Aspinall found himself directly in the crosshairs of this unforgiving policy. Just for a moment, try to consider the facts from Dana White's cold, business-oriented perspective. Aspinall held the interim title for over 18 months without unifying it, during which time the entire division stagnated. When he finally became the undisputed champion, his very first defense ended in a no contest after less than 5 minutes of action. And now, he was facing a completely indefinite recovery timeline, with potential surgery required. The heavyweight division, which had already been frozen solid during the entire Jon Jones saga, would now remain paralyzed for months, maybe even a year more, with absolutely no end in sight. Aspinall's Brown syndrome might require complex surgery, delaying his return significantly. While he's been cleared for some light training, his priority is, and should be, full vision recovery. There was absolutely no guarantee he would ever return to his previous dominant form. The eye injury was career-threatening, and nobody on Earth could predict how long a full recovery would actually take. From a purely business standpoint, the UFC needed an active heavyweight champion. The pay-per-view numbers demanded it, the fans demanded it, the broadcasters demanded it, and Dana White has built a billion-dollar empire by giving the people what they wanted. The champion, Tom Aspinall, remained singularly focused on his recovery, as any sane person would. But the organization was singularly focused on business, and those two diametrically opposed priorities were about to collide in the most dramatic and heartbreaking fashion imaginable. Yes, Dana White had committed to the UFC, covering all of Aspinall's medical care, a commitment relayed via Hunter Campbell, but there was still no direct outreach from White himself. The crucial financial support came through intermediaries, but never from the president. White had initially promised the rematch would happen as soon as possible, potentially in early 2026, once Aspinall was cleared. But early 2026 was fast approaching, and Aspinall showed absolutely no signs of being anywhere close to ready to compete. And those words Dana spoke at the post-fight presser, "Both guys are not injured," had aged horribly, proving to be demonstrably false given Aspinall's extensive medical documentation. The public backlash had split right down the middle. Supporters hailed Aspinall as a smart, modern athlete for protecting his long-term career. Detractors, however, claimed he made heavyweights look bad by not just powering through it. Then, Henry Cejudo went off on Dana White on December 3, 2025, stating, "Everybody needs to man up," including Dana White. His rant connected directly to Aspinall's case as a prime example of the ongoing mess within the sport. And think about this. Jon Jones faced punishment for delays he caused voluntarily through his own negotiation tactics. If Jones faced consequences for that, what awaited a champion who was now publicly criticizing the president, disputing his narrative, and was completely unable to provide any kind of timeline for a return? The ongoing and very public strain between Tom Aspinall and the organization he represented showed absolutely no signs of resolution. Aspinall's camp was pushing for UFC-funded specialist care, while Dana White remained personally and pointedly silent on the matter. The writing was not just on the wall, it was etched in stone. Something had to give. Aspinall was deeply disappointed with Dana, but it was clear that Dana was completely fed up. He simply did not take the injury as seriously as Aspinall and his doctors believed was warranted. He wanted and needed the heavyweight category to be dynamic, led by a champion who actively fights to defend his belt. Today, all of that speculation has finally ended. Dana White's decision to strip Tom Aspinall of the UFC Heavyweight Championship sends shockwaves that will rattle the entire combat sports landscape for years to come. The champion who waited over 18 months for his rightful shot at undisputed glory, the man who took fights on short notice to save cards, who served loyally and patiently through the entire Jon Jones saga, has now been dethroned. Not by a worthy opponent inside the cage, but by a cold, calculated decision made in a corporate boardroom. The ramifications of this decision extend far beyond Tom Aspinall himself. Every single fighter on the UFC roster now understands the unwritten terms of their employment with brutal clarity. Injuries, even those sustained from illegal fouls, can and will cost you your title. Criticizing the president publicly carries severe consequences. Your own recovery timelines are not tolerated, regardless of the circumstances. The unwritten rules of the UFC have now been written in permanent, indelible, and consider for a moment what this truly means for fighter safety going forward. If a champion can be stripped of his title while recovering from an injury caused by an illegal foul, what possible incentive exists for fighters to protect themselves? The system now, essentially, punishes the victim of fouls while the perpetrator faces minimal, if any, consequences. Think about it. Ciryl Gane committed the illegal action that caused this entire catastrophe, yet he faces no punishment. Meanwhile, Tom Aspinall loses his championship. The precedent being set here will reverberate through the sport for years to come. Future champions will have to weigh their own long-term health against the very real possibility of losing their titles. Future fighters who sustain injuries from fouls will have to seriously consider whether reporting them honestly even serves their best career interests. And where does this leave Tom Aspinall? He had previously hinted at boxing temptations, if his UFC support ever faltered. Perhaps that path now becomes a far more attractive option for a fighter who feels profoundly betrayed by the organization he served so loyally. The heavyweight division now faces a new era of uncertainty about who will even compete for the newly vacated championship. Ciryl Gane stands as the logical first choice, having been just seconds away from potentially finishing Aspinall before the foul occurred. Other top contenders like Alexander Volkov and Jailton Almeida will undoubtedly stake their claims. The division will move on, because it has to, because the business demands it, and because Dana White has never, ever let sentiment stand in the way of progress. But the question still lingers, and it's a big one. Is this really progress? Or is this simply the cold, hard calculus of business completely overriding the human element that makes this sport so compelling in the first place? Champions are supposed to lose their titles in the cage, not in boardroom meetings. They are supposed to be beaten by better opponents, not stripped by their promoters. For Tom Aspinall, the road forward is completely unclear. His eyes must heal before any thought of fighting can resume. His relationship with Dana White and the UFC appears to be damaged beyond any hope of repair. And his championship, the single goal he sacrificed years of his life to achieve, has been taken from him without a single punch being thrown. The legal implications of this decision also remain totally unexplored. Could Aspinall pursue damages for being stripped while recovering from an injury he sustained in a UFC cage? Could he argue that the organization failed in its duty to protect him from illegal fouls and then punished him for the resulting injury? These are questions that may very well end up being answered in courtrooms rather than in octagon. In the end, everyone knew who was at fault. The fighter who extended his fingers, the rules that failed to adequately punish fouling, the glove design that facilitates injury, and the organization that ultimately chose spectacle over fighter safety. But none of that mattered in the end. What mattered was business. What mattered was money. What mattered was an active heavyweight division. And Tom Aspinall paid the ultimate price for circumstances that were never ever his fault. The throne now sits empty, waiting for someone new to claim it. And Tom Aspinall can only watch from the sidelines, his championship gone, his eyes still healing, his entire future uncertain. This is the brutal reality of professional fighting in a reality where champions can be stripped while recovering from injuries caused by illegal foul. A reality where public criticism of the boss carries the heaviest of consequences. A reality where business trumps loyalty every single time. Thanks for watching. Check out the other cards on the screen.